The first decades of the 20th century ushered in a period of cultural and social upheaval throughout the Western world. Making sense of relentless change became a matter of cultural survival. It was artists working on the avant-garde who captured and expressed these changes in such a form that peoples and nations could reflect upon their implications. In Brazilian literature, new ideas found fertile ground to take root. Brazilian writers absorbed influences from Spanish-speaking Latin America, North America, and Europe, especially Portugal. But Brazilian avant-garde literature also made contributions that were uniquely its own. Modernismo was a cultural movement that first appeared in Brazil at the beginning of the 20th century. Its sensibilities blended the aesthetics of the French and Italian vanguards with Brazilian themes and styles. A seminal event in the evolution of Modernismo was an exhibition called The Week of Modern Art, held in February of 1922 in the São Paulo Municipal Theater. This happening was not just a meeting of intellectuals. It morphed into a cultural symposium that defined Modernismo and introduced it to Brazilian society at large. The movement took root primarily in the country's large cities, São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Its first literary expression was a novel called Hallucinated City from 1922, written by Mário de Andrade and set in São Paulo. A driving force behind the Week of Modern Art, Andrade was a central figure in Modernismo and went on to become an icon of Brazilian culture. By turns a poet, journalist, essayist, musicologist, folklorist, and academic, his writing exhibited a texture and versatility that united regional accents into a single voice. He wrote two novels, Love, Intransitive Verb, and the better-known Macunaíma. Macunaíma was a rhapsody in which the author explored the character of primitivism through a Freudian lens. The novel's protagonist, Macunaíma, is described as a hero without a character. Born of the jungle, he possesses remarkable, almost miraculous abilities. In many ways, his character anticipates what came to be known as magical realism. The novel puts on display Andrade's encyclopedic knowledge of Brazil's linguistic, cultural, and musical diversity.
Macunaíma, el héroe sin ningún carácter, ¿no? Tomando la palabra carácter en duplo sentido, sin ninguna característica propia, pero también el tipo que no es confiable, ¿eh? Y él retoma ese héroe, Macunaíma. Él es hijo del miedo de la noche con una india indígena. Y él cuando nace negro. Y durante la narrativa se convierte en blanco. Es decir, está ahí tenemos las tres matrices de Brasil, el negro, el indio y el blanco.
In the pure depths of the thick forest, Macunaíma is born, the hero of our kind. He is so black that he is blue, and son of the fear of the night. There was a time when silence was so intense, listening to the mumbling of the Uraricoera River, that the Indian woman, Tapanumas, gave birth to an ugly creature. And that child was what they would later call Macunaíma.
In his novels, Andrade satirized the bourgeoisie using montage techniques that he borrowed from Cubism. He initiated the anthropophagy movement, playing off an academic term for cannibalism to found an artistic faction fiercely critical of the frauds perpetuated by civilization. He published the Anthropophagist Manifesto in 1928, a text combining ancient mythical motifs with the latest Freudian theories. Only cannibalism unites us, he wrote, socially, economically, philosophically. We want the Cariba Revolution, bigger than the French Revolution, for the unification of all the efficient revolutions for the sake of human beings.
Las vanguardias brasileñas han tenido un proceso de radicalización muy fuerte en todos los planos. Han sido lo que han ido más lejos en el cuestionamiento de la autonomía del arte, han sido lo que han ido más lejos en cuestiones políticas, a tal punto que ya hacia fines de los 20 ellos ya asumen una postura totalmente de izquierda y plantean un programa en el que ya están cuestionando muchas cuestiones, ¿no? Por ejemplo, la cuestión de la propiedad, la cuestión del catolicismo, ¿no? Al cual son realmente muy fuertes, y todo eso se articula en un movimiento que es el movimiento de antropofagia.
Cuando pensamos en el modernismo no podemos dejar de pensar en Oswald de Andrade. Oswald, mucho más intuitivo que letrado, programático o académico, con su manifiesto antropófago, da cuenta de ese contacto, de la problematicidad de ese contacto. Pero lo hace en términos dilemáticos de una vanguardia internacionalista. Lo hace en términos de apropiarse de la disyunción, to be or not to be, that's the question. O sea que no hay terceras posiciones, no hay confín, no hay interregno, no hay hiato heterogéneo como problema. Es to be or not to be, es binarismo, es metafísica.
The aesthetic experimentalism of the week of modern art gave rise to a generation of authors who were deeply immersed in social issues of the day. The movement brought together poets, novelists, and even sociologists, and included such names as Josué de Castro, Cayo Prado Jr., and later Jorge Amado and Jorge de Lima.
We were pure ones, actually hemmed in by daily disgust. The mental health of each one of us denied us any cultivation of pain. In this sense, perhaps the futurist theories had a unique and beneficent influence over us. No one thought in terms of sacrifice. No one put himself out as being misunderstood. None imagined himself a forerunner or martyr. We were an outpost of condemned heroes.
In Rio de Janeiro, the leader of Modernismo was the diplomat and writer Graciliano. In 1921, he published an influential essay called An Aesthetics of Life, in which he examined the influence of Brazil's mixed cultural heritage on its artistic output. His fascination with Modernismo did not sit well with the artistic establishment, however, and he was estranged from the mainstream Brazilian Academy of Letters, of which he was a founding member. Rio de Janeiro was also home to a group of writers known as the Revista Festa, among whom the poet Cecília Meirelles stood out. Another group, the Revista Estética, was led by Sergio Buarque de Holanda and Prudente de Moraes Neto. In Portugal, the key figure of Modernismo was, without a doubt, Fernando Pessoa. He was the most significant Portuguese-language poet of the 20th century and served as a sort of transoceanic parallel for Brazilian poets of the period. Yet despite his broad influence, the uniqueness of Pessoa's work remains undisputed. Sheltered in an undeclared madness, he exploited language to translate the seeming chaos in his mind into the idiom of the common reader. He adopted a dizzying variety of pen names. These alter egos came to represent different and often warring worldviews and identities, all of whom found expression through Pessoa's pen. The classicist and Horatian Ricardo Reis, the technical Whitmanesque Álvaro de Campos, the metaphysical Bernardo Soares, whose name appears on the Book of Disquietude, and Alberto Caeiro, whom Pessoa regarded as his teacher, a poet in love with nature and pure sensations, of whom he declared, "He sees things with the eyes only, not with the mind." In typical fashion, the political and artistic vanguards that arose in turn-of-the-century Latin America grew up together and were, in fact, inseparable, playing off each other as they reshaped the cultural landscape. As it emerged from its agrarian, oligarchic past into an era of middle-class-oriented democratization, Brazil underwent intense growing pains. For 30 years, the nation had been dominated by ruling elites who ran the old republic. In the 1920s, Luis Carlos Prestes led a revolt comprised largely of conscripted servicemen and military officers from the middle class. This came to be known as the Teniente Rebellion, taken from the Portuguese word for lieutenant, which was initially stifled by the government. However, the effects of the ongoing depression weakened the old republic, and the populist Getúlio Vargas was emboldened by the Teniente uprising to make his own play for power. A bloodless coup in 1930 ousted the ruling elite, and Vargas was installed as president, ushering in the centralist and industrialist Estado Novo, the new state. Despite having sent troops to fight with the Allies in World War II, Vargas was ousted at the war's end by a military coup in 1945. Vargas returned to power through free elections in 1950, but was overthrown again 4 years later, this time through the agency of foreign powers. The Vargas era ended with his suicide in 1954. His departure from the scene initiated a period of modernization in Brazil, marked by the growing influence of industrialists from São Paulo. Yet despite this renewal, Brazil continues to be plagued by grave social problems. A huge disparity between the abject poverty of the underclass and the ostentatious wealth of the upper class persists to this day, and belies an upbeat image promulgated by Carnival, the samba, and world-famous soccer stars. It was in this turbulent political and social context that the author Graciliano Ramos appeared. He was a journalist and sometime politician who served as mayor of a provincial city and was once imprisoned by the Vargas regime on vaguely defined charges. He introduced a psychological edge to the narrative of the regional novel, a trait that can be discerned in works such as Angst from 1936, Barren Lives from 1938, Infancy from 1945, and Insomnia from 1947. In the mid-1930s, José Lins do Rego also adopted Brazil's wild and vast northeastern province as a character in his literary output. He worked in a tradition that had come to be known as the Nordestino novel, born in the late 19th century along Brazil's northeast coast. While most earlier Nordestino works had been socially progressive romances, do Rego's novels were stained with tragedy, depicting a society that was falling to pieces. His language is direct and colloquial, in the Northeast style. He is best known for his semi-autobiographical sugarcane cycle of novels that chronicles the social transformation of the Brazilian Northeast. The first of this series, Plantation Boy, was published in 1932, but his principal work is generally considered to be Dead Fires from 1943.
Una novela nordestina que muchas veces ha sido caracterizada como regionalista, pero que no es para nada regionalista, porque es una novela muy atenta justamente a una suerte de modernización literaria muy fuerte, y en ese sentido introduce un elemento perturbador en lo que ha sido el regionalismo, que generalmente los regionalismos han sido movimientos muy de anclarse en un pasado, en una tradición, y acá no sucede nada de eso, es decir, tampoco es una mirada exterior, no es una mirada exterior sobre la región, sino más bien es tratar de reflexionar sobre la relación entre escritura y región.
Raul Bopp was born in Rio Grande do Sul in 1898. The descendant of German immigrants, he went into the diplomatic service after the revolution of the 1930s. In São Paulo, he immersed himself in modernismo and joined both the anthropophagist movement and Verde Amarelo, a group that celebrated a renewed sense of nationalism. Both groups championed authentically Brazilian poetry, verse that proudly displayed its native colors. And they tended to look down on the European avant-gardes, which they viewed as vainly striving to fabricate their own mythology. Brazil, by contrast, was rooted in African and indigenous narratives. It had its own rich and untapped mythic heritage, derived from authentically lived lives. Pop's main work was Cobra Norato from 1931. It is a free verse poem that narrates the adventures of a youth dressed in the skin of a serpent named Norate. The hero sets out into the Amazonian jungle in search of his fiancée, the daughter of Queen Lucia. The poem's dreamlike narrative and vivid language, steeped in traditional rhythms, give Cobra Norato the feel of an historical document wrapped in the cloak of literature.
This is the school of the trees. They are studying geometry. You are blind of birth. You must obey the river. Aiya, aiya, we're enslaved by the river. You must drown the man in the shade. The wilderness is enemy of the man. Aiya, aiya, we are enslaved by the river. You, what are you going to do above there? I must announce the moon when she raises behind the bushes. And you? I must give the hours in the heart of the forest.
Among the poets working in the Rio Grande do Sul region, Augusto Meyer in particular cultivated a gaucho style of modernismo, so called for the rough cowboys who lived in the area along the border with Uruguay. His first important work was Greenheart from 1926, a work that highlights the serenity of the countryside in his native land. He also wrote essays, setting himself apart as a thinker of refined taste and high culture. The term concrete poetry refers to verses that are both written and graphically designed. In concrete poems, the typographical arrangement of words themselves is a key element of the work's overall intended effect. The word itself becomes a physical object that is a structural component of the poetry, not merely an invisible vehicle for conveying its meaning. Concrete was born simultaneously in São Paulo, Brazil, and Ulm, Germany. Its midwives were three Brazilian poets, Augusto de Campos, Haroldo de Campos, and Décio Pignatár, as well as the Swiss-Bolivian poet Eugen Gomringer, who was based in Ulm. The first exhibition of Noigandres, Brazilian concrete poetry, was held in December of 1956 in the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo, and then in Rio de Janeiro 3 months later.
Son tres poetas paulistas, que son Haroldo de Campos, Augusto de Campos y Décio Pignatari, que comienzan a preguntarse sobre la posibilidad de hacer una poesía concreta, es decir, una poesía que fuera de carácter visual, que fuera de carácter espacial, que trabajara también con los mínimos indispensables, que no tuviera tema, que no tuviera, que cortara los lazos de la sintaxis, es decir, que no fuera un tipo de verso tradicional. Ellos planteaban que el verso había llegado a su crisis como unidad de sentido, sino más bien buscar como superposiciones de palabras y de alguna manera a partir de ahí crear un objeto nuevo.
These shows champion the works of Brazilian poets alongside those of concrete sculptors and painters from the groups Ruptura in São Paulo and Frente in Rio de Janeiro. A key figure in this movement was Haroldo de Campos, author of more than 30 books, among them Right of Way, Galaxies, God and the Devil in Goethe's Faust, and Ideogram from 1994. He also translated Homer, James Joyce, and Stefan Mallarmé into Portuguese, and was a professor of semiotics.
Poetry in time of hunger, hunger in time of poetry. Poetry instead of the man, pronoun instead of the name. Man instead of the poetry, name instead of the pronoun. Poetry to give in name. To name is to give the name. I name in the name. I name the man in the middle of hunger. I name the hunger.
Brazilian cordel literature was a popular format for presenting folk novels, poems, and songs. These works were offered as cheaply printed booklets and pamphlets. In Portuguese, the term cordel means string literature, so named because the pamphlets were hung from strings at fairs and in open-air markets to lure customers. Cordel literature came to the country in the second half of the 19th century by way of the Portuguese and was quite popular in the 1920s and 30s. Cordel literature is still available today, particularly in the northeast of Brazil. Some of the most famous poets of this genre were the turn-of-the-century writer Leandro Gomes de Barrios, and more recently, José Alves Sobrinho, Homero do Rego Barros, and Antonio Gonçalves da Silva. Several important nordestino writers were influenced by cordel literature, including João Cabral de Melo Neto, José Lins do Rego, and João Guimarães Rosa. As the 20th century progressed, individual authors began to appear who came to characterize the literature of each succeeding decade. In the 1940s, Carlos Drummond de Andrade established himself as a national poet of breathtaking versatility. In the mid-50s, two important authors put out their best novels. Guimarães Rosa published The Devil to Pay in the Backlands, and Jorge Amado offered Gabriela, Clove and Cinnamon. In the 60s, the novelist Clarice Lispector appeared on the scene. Her Yiddish-inflected prose turned the Brazilian literary tradition on its head by addressing directly her country's national malaise and the anxiety it provoked. And in the 70s, Rubem Fonseca and Nélida Piñón came into their own as authors of short stories and novels, respectively. Over time, a fundamental incident in the literary career of Carlos Drummond de Andrade came to be a turning point in the plot of contemporary Brazilian poetry. When, in July of 1928, the poet published a work entitled In the Middle of the Road in issue number 3 of the Review of Anthropophagy, he surely could not have imagined that Brazilian poetry would never be the same again. The poem has been called variously buffoonery, frivolity, and amusement, a futurist trifle, and the indelible mark of a phase of craziness in Brazilian poetry.
In the middle of the road there was a stone. There was a stone in the middle of the road. There was a stone. In the middle of the road there was a stone. Never should I forget this event in the life of my fatigued retinas. Never should I forget that in the middle of the road there was a stone. There was a stone in the middle of the road. In the middle of the road there was a stone.
Drummond's first book, from 1930, had borne the modest title, Some Poetry. Andrade was not given to dramatic proclamations about drastic breaks with the past. In fact, he believed that the poet's place in the modern world is marginal. In his poem, The Survivor, he writes, "Impossible to compose a poem at this height of human evolution. Impossible to write a poem, be it just one line, of true poetry." Andrade's work is generally divided into different categories: everyday poetry, political poetry, and metaphysical poetry. His poem, Death in a Plain, calmly inventories the sequence of events and observations that lead up to a terrifying end.
O whiteness, serenity under violence of death without previous notice, careful despite the unavoidable closeness of atmospheric danger. A shattering blast of air, splinter of wind on the neck, lightning, flash, burst, crack. Broken we tumble, straight down I fall, and am turned into news.
João Guimarães Rosa was one of the main innovators in Brazilian literature of the mid-20th century, renowned for his expressive richness and his thematic creativity. Born in Minas Gerais in 1908, he was both a doctor and a diplomat, and demonstrated himself to be a consummate Renaissance man. He dabbled in journalism and, after a trip to the wilds of Mato Grosso, published With Mariano the Cowboy, a poetic chronicle of his experiences there.
El máximo del siglo XX es João Guimarães Rosa, en términos de novela y cuento principalmente. Y también Clarice, que revolucionan esa casi tercera fase del modernismo brasileiro, ¿no? Com sua escritura intimista e verborrágica, com sua pontuação muito particular que dificulta a leitura em certos momentos. Y entonces lo que esa generación trae es una nueva manera de ver la literatura.
As a diplomat, Guimarães Rosa traveled to and lived in various cities in Europe and Latin America. He was a connoisseur of languages and acquired classical Greek and Sanskrit along with the major idioms of Europe. He was fond of saying that the best way of understanding a person was to speak their language. His great novel, The Devil to Pay in the Backlands, appeared in 1956. Riobaldo, the protagonist and narrator, relates his story in an almost untranslatable commingling of colloquial sertão speech with cultivated, almost Baroque prose. The exotic grammar of this work and its nearly impenetrable prose evoke the dark and mysterious interior of Brazil's vast jungles and cultural subconscious. Yet, at its core, The Devil to Pay in the Backlands is a classic Bildungsroman, a quest for personal identity that embroils language, history, and psychology in one man's experience of a classic rite of passage.
I will explain myself. The devil grazes within the man, in the creases of the man. He is the ruined man, or the man turned the other way around. On the loose, by himself, citizen, there is no devil. None. Not even spirit. I never saw them. Now, if I would tell you, well, the devil organizes his black state within the creatures, in women, in men, even in children, I promise you. There are even bad races of stone, hideous, poisonous, that spoil the water deadly if it is lying at the bottom of a well. Within them the devil sleeps, they are the demon. And the demon, who is therefore the meaning of a malignant Mercury, was he given the order to follow his way? Does he have license to graze in the fields?
The career of the writer Jorge Amado is often linked with a particular city in the Northeast, São Salvador, the capital of the state of Bahia. São Salvador was a hotbed of cultural syncretism, a place where diverse beliefs and worldviews were fused and inflected with Afro-Brazilian music and candomblé, an African animist religion brought to the New World by slaves. He was the youngest of a famous triumvirate that included José Lins do Rego and Graciliano Ramos. He published his first novel in 1933 at the age of 18, a work entitled The Country of Carnival. He went on to write Cacao, a novel that revealed his communist leanings as it described the social and political scene in the state of Bahia. This was followed by his novel Sweat, which initiated a cycle of works dedicated to the city of São Salvador. Later installments include Sea of Death, Captains of the Sand, and Tent of Miracles. Among his most notable titles are Doña Flor and Her Two Husbands, Teresa Batista, Home from the Wars, and Gabriela, Clove and Cinnamon, which Jean-Paul Sartre described as the best example of folk novel.
From the operating bridge of the boat, a man, still young, well-dressed and shaved, watched the city. The black pupils, the torn eyes, and the hard mouth and strong chin announced that he was the decided, practical, expert man who knows his desires and how to get them. The captain gave him the telescope. Munhinho Falsao said when receiving it, "I do not need it. I know every house, every man."
Amado's contemporary, Érico Veríssimo emerged as the most important urban Brazilian writer of the second half of the 20th century. He was educated in Porto Alegre, one of the largest cities in Brazil, and the bustling capital of Rio Grande do Sul. Here he took in the works of modern English authors such as Aldous Huxley and Somerset Maugham, some of whose work he translated into Portuguese. A voluminous writer, his body of work can be divided into distinct phases. The first period is populated by intimate evocations of the urban experience. In his next set of works, he explored the social and cultural milieu of his homeland, writing a chronicle of customs that spanned several generations. He was, in fact, chronicling nothing less than the evolution of the Brazilian nation. Among his best-known novels are Clarissa from 1933, Crossroads from 2 years later, and The Rest is Silence, which offers up a harsh critique of the clerical class.
Many times at night, Tonio stood still at the corner of the block of the Santiagos, watching the tower with nostalgia and sadness, seeing in the old windows the light of a strange home. One day at dawn, contemplating not for the first time the silhouette of the house where he had been born, he made a resolution to forget her and to follow his own way. Nevertheless, from then on, through time, from dreams, from people, from works and books, he oriented his life to the search for another family, another roof, another shelter.
Verissimo's leftist views put him at odds with the Vargas dictatorship, and he went into self-imposed exile, first in California and then Portugal, where he ran afoul of the Salazar dictatorship. In the 60s, his fiction intensified, incorporating political themes into tightly wrought narratives, as in his novel The Ambassador, which indirectly critiqued the military coup of 1964. Many writers of this period have been assigned to the so-called Generation of 45, including the noted poet João Cabral de Melo Neto, a native of Pernambuco in the Northeast. His writing is characterized by cold, dry, concise, and highly visual language, devoid of sentimentalism. His poems are conceived as architectural artifacts that often reflect on the art and craft of poetry itself.
The atmosphere that surrounds you reaches such atmospheres that it transforms many things that concern or surround you. It is certain that the surface of your external person, of your skin and all that touching yourself is found, it has nothing of luxurious contour, false, academic, of a surface when one says that it is like silk.
The history of Brazilian literature is marked by sharp ruptures with the past that drive narrative to unexpected places. In the 19th century, the catalyst for change was the realist author Machado de Assis. And in the 20th century, this role was played by Guimarães Rosa and Clarice Lispector. Lispector in particular has become a touchpoint for contemporary Brazilian writers and readers. Her writing is fueled by existential intensity, fraught with meaningful silence and intricate narratives. Her prose is disquieting, playful, and inquisitive. She burst onto the scene in 1944 with a novel that immediately put her at the forefront of Brazilian literature, Near the Wild Heart. Like her other works, this book was characterized by a free-flowing stream of consciousness that allowed for the free association of ideas, characters, and themes.
Clarice es muy interesante porque siguiendo la línea que viene desde Machado de Assis, que es esta cosa del psicológico, ella radicaliza eso. ¿Cómo puede ser? El buceo en la subjetividad del personaje es de tal manera radical y fuerte que la trama, la historia de las novelas y de los cuentos a veces se reducen al mínimo. Entonces es una literatura profundamente intimista. Por un lado existencialista a la vez hay algo de existencialismo ahí también, ¿no? Hay algo de psicologismo, sin ninguna duda, y su técnica narrativa es bastante particular.
There were many good sensations. To climb the mountain, to stand at the top, and without watching, feel the conquered extension of the cattle there far away. The wind blew the clothes and hair, the free arms, and the heart beating wildly, and the clear and calm face under the sun. Understanding that the earth underfoot was so deep and so secret that it was not necessary to fear an invasion of the knowledge dissolving its mystery. That sensation had some quality of glory. Lispector published many other books after Near the Wild Heart, such as The Besieged City from 1949 and Family Ties from 1960. The short stories collected in the volume entitled Silence were published 3 years before her death in 1974 and present in condensed form the irreverent tenor of her narrative voice. Her writing brought about a sea change in Brazilian literature, transforming it from plot-driven, picturesque regional writing into fully realized modern prose. Lispector paints with words, and, like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, to whom she is often compared, was an unruly child of surrealism. Her works are highly detailed canvases of the present, like the still life short stories Dry Point of Horses and That Is Where I Am Going. She was fascinated by the secret life of objects, the splendor of animals, the pain of people, and she was always and forever acutely attuned to the deafening sound of the silences. Silence at night in the mountain is so vast, and so depopulated. In vain one tries to work not to hear it, to think quickly to disguise it, or to invent a program, a fragile point that feebly unites us to the improbable and sudden light of morning. How to surpass the peace that stalks us? So great a silence that desperation is ashamed. So high the mountains that desperation is ashamed. The ears sharpen, the head inclines, the whole body listening. No rumor, no rooster. How to be within reach of that deep meditation of silence. Of that silence without memory of words. If it is death, how to reach it. The novelist and short story writer Nélida Piñón was heavily influenced by her friend Clarice Lispector, yet carved out a unique identity for herself as an author. Born in 1937, she is one of the most respected living writers in her country, a member of the Brazilian Academy of Letters and the Academy of Philosophy of Brazil. She is also the recipient of the Juan Rulfo International Prize in Latin American and Caribbean Literature, as well as the prestigious Prince of Asturias Award. Some of her most recognized works include 2 books of short stories, The Time of Fruits from 1966 and Room of Arms from 1973, and the novels Thebes of My Heart from 1974, The Force of Destiny from 1977, The Republic of Dreams from 1999, and Desert Voices from 2004. While many of Piñón's books mine her autobiography and family history for material, Desert Voices delves into the memory of a character alien to the author, one who is in a state of constant danger. In so doing, she conjures the fascination of the ancient Far Eastern tales in The Book of 1001 Nights. The voice of Scheherazade echoes by the palace, arrives in the kitchen, is mixed with the herbs furiously rubbed to the skin of the sheep that turns over live coal. Each servant below the shadow of the empire grabs pieces of meat and words heard by half,
incapable of anticipating the epilogue of histories.
The literary trend known as costumbrismo originated in Spain and spread like wildfire throughout the Latin American world. Works of this genre offer romantic, often simplistic literary interpretations of local everyday life, mannerisms, and customs. The writer, Alice Darrell Caldera Brandt, writing under the pseudonym Helena Morley, set her sights on deconstructing the conventions of costumbrismo. Her seminal 1942 work, My Life as a Girl, is a diaristic novel written in a youthful and candid style, in which she describes the rural experience as seen through the eyes of a young woman.
At 14 years old, she sees herself in a strange city, Vienna, without speaking the language, without anybody to vouch for her, immersed in an entrancing melancholy. Installed into a cheap hotel by her mother's friend, Marchane indulges herself in dramatic reflections on Western culture. She meets new people, makes friends, loses friends, knows the drugs, and falls in love with a boy who discovers he is gay, which makes her suffer immensely.
In the second half of the 20th century, a group of Brazilian women writers, inspired by the surrealist Argentinian writer Alejandra Pizarnik, turned their focus towards the power of words to change society. The poet Elizabeth Vega personifies each word of her poems, treating them like beings unto themselves. Ana Cristina Cesar, known simply as Ana C., studied in Europe and returned to Brazil. She was acutely aware of the subordinate role of women in the Brazilian patriarchal society of the 70s. She wrote poems and essays for newspapers and magazines about overcoming the modernist movement in Brazil and fighting against the repressed role of women. Like Alejandra Pizarnik, she ultimately committed suicide. Among those who addressed female sexuality directly is Marcia Denser, whose short stories feature storylines in which the established social and sexual roles of males and females in Brazilian society are reversed. Lícia Fagundes Teles is one of only 3 female members of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. Her most famous novel, The Girl in the Photograph, tells the story of 3 young women in the early 1970s, during a repressive era of military dictatorship. In her short story, A Seminar for Rats from 1977, she mixes psychology, dreams, and surrealism in a potent evocation of magical realism.
The young doctor took the executive chef by the arm and dragged him to a bench. "Now calm down. What's the problem? And don't yell. No hysterical screams here. Come on, what is it?" "The lobsters, the hens, the potatoes. They've eaten everything, everything. They didn't leave a grain of rice in the bowl. They've eaten everything, and what they didn't have time to eat, they have taken with them." "But who ate everything? Who?" "The rats, doctor. The rats." "Rats? What rats?"
The writer Rubem Fonseca has lived in Rio de Janeiro since he was 7 years old. But his first vocation wasn't to narrate the rough and tumble life of the city's streets, but rather to control them. His introduction to city life was as a police officer. He was actually quite good at this line of work, and rose up through the ranks to become commissioner. His pinball career also includes stints as a lawyer, journalist, movie critic, and scriptwriter. His stories and novels tie these varied experiences together into crime dramas populated by fictionalized versions of real characters he encountered in the streets. An avid fan of hard-boiled fiction, and in particular, the work of Raymond Chandler, Fonseca crafts stories that are undeniably Brazilian. His prose is agile, economical, and accurate, and always full of a humor that is devoid of scandal. He writes epics of daily things, woven around simple folks, in the tradition of the master short story writer Anton Chekhov. In his work, Fonseca is able to encompass the contradictions that are Brazil, an industrialized nation marred by abject poverty, an urbanized culture set alongside the last great wilderness that is the Amazon, a linguistic and social oasis set within Spanish-speaking Latin America. His first novel, The Morel Case, came out in 1973 to critical acclaim and was promptly confiscated by the police. In the 90s, he published Vast Emotions and Imperfect Thoughts and the novel August, in which he takes on the violence that racked Brazil in August of 1954, during the turmoil preceding the suicide of President Getúlio Vargas.
Laying down in bed, with the eyes opened without seeing, Vargas imagined how his death would be received by his enemies. He would do what had to be done. Forgiveness and redemption. A euphoric sensation of pride and dignity seized him. Yes, his daughter would now pardon him. He took the gun from the drawer and laid down in bed. He put the gun on the left side of his chest and pulled the trigger.
To get a sense of how forms and genres commingle in Brazilian art, look no further than the global musical phenomenon known as bossa nova. This music was born in the mid to late 50s, and one of its early figures was a poet, Vinícius de Moraes, known as O Poetinha, or the Little Poet. He was born in 1913 and initially went into the diplomatic corps, where he played a role in spreading popular Brazilian music as he traveled the world. He began writing lyrics for famous Brazilian musicians such as Tom Jobim and Toquinho, and became an avid promoter of bossa nova. His songs have been performed by artists as diverse as Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, Count Basie, and Billy Eckstine. His play, Orpheus of the Carnival, tapped into Greek mythology for its inspiration and was made into the Academy Award-winning film Black Orpheus. As a poet, his career can be roughly divided into two phases. The first, in which he sought the transcendent through long, mystical verses, and the later phase, where his approach was more earthbound, but marked by daring formal experimentation. He has been hailed by critics as the last romantic in a generation of iconoclasts.
Neither greater love nor stranger exists than my love. That does not calm the adored one. If it feels her cheerful, it is sad, and it is pleased if it sees her disturbed. That it is left alone if it is resisted by the bitter heart, and that likes more the eternal adventure which persists than an existence badly ventured. Crazy love of mine that hurts when it touches, and when it hurts vibrates. It prefers this to death, and it lives the adventure. Always faithful to its law of every moment, solved, sore, delirious, in its passion of everything, and its madness.
With such diffuse borders, Brazilian literature cannot and should not be isolated from the literatures of the rest of the South American continent. Nonetheless, its unique origins distinguish Brazil's literary tradition from the Latin American cultural milieu. Brazil bred writers who came from wholly different backgrounds and developed in an entirely different context. From the discovery of the New World to this day, Brazil has, both literally and figuratively, spoken in a different voice. In the colonial period, the Portuguese Empire did not have to fight for dominance with an advanced civilization such as the Maya or the Inca, and its various cultural inputs were also distinctive, bringing together African, indigenous, and Portuguese influences. The 20th century saw an explosion of diverse literary genres. At the same time, it was a period of coming together. Literature united journalistic observation, political participation, and experimental initiatives. As the 20th century progressed, the line between genres became ever more blurred, as between the memoir and police fiction, or between poetry and music. Today, Brazilian literature continues to struggle with incorporating new tones and forms that can do justice to its turbulent history. And it keeps on finding points of contact with its cultural neighbors, thanks in part to stronger political ties with the rest of Latin America. Evidence of this trend can be seen in the increasing number of Spanish translations of Brazilian works, and more Portuguese translations of Spanish-language writers from the continent. It is possible to envision a Brazilian literature of the 21st century that is truly Pan-American, enriched by exchange with and a powerful influence on the rest of Latin America.